She appeared like a ghost against the endless Dakota horizon, barefoot and broken, her dress torn by thorns and cruelty. "Please don't look," she whispered. But Cole Hensley had already seen what mattered, not her wounds, but her courage to keep walking. In that moment, something shifted in the widower's carefully guarded heart, something he thought had died with his wife 3 winters ago. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across his ranch, and neither of them knew that this single encounter would rewrite both their destinies forever. Subscribe to discover how one act of unexpected kindness can heal 2 shattered souls. The Dakota wind carried more than dust that evening. It carried the scent of desperation and something else Cole Hensley couldn't name. He stood on his porch, coffee growing cold in his weathered hands, watching the sun bleed orange across the endless prairie. 3 years of solitude had taught him to read the land's moods, but nothing had prepared him for the figure that emerged from the heat shimmer like a mirage made flesh. She moved with the careful steps of someone who had learned that the ground itself could betray, each footfall deliberate despite her obvious exhaustion. Her dress, once perhaps blue or grey, hung in tatters that spoke of thorns and worse things, and her dark hair fell in tangled waves around shoulders that trembled with more than cold. Cole set his cup down slowly, his rancher's instincts warring with something deeper, something that had been sleeping in his chest since Martha's death. The woman, for he could see now that she was young, perhaps 24 or 25, had stopped at the edge of his property line as if an invisible wall held her back. Her bare feet were caked with dust and what looked like dried blood, and she swayed slightly, like a tree that had weathered too many storms. He wanted to call out, to offer help, but something in her posture warned him to move carefully. She was a wild thing, beautiful and broken, and wild things bolted when cornered. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the whisper of wind through the tall grass and the distant lowing of cattle settling for the night. Cole found himself studying her face, what he could see of it beneath the curtain of her hair, and felt his heart perform a strange, forgotten rhythm. There was something familiar in her bearing, not her features, but her essence, the way Martha had looked that first winter when pneumonia had nearly claimed her, fragile but fighting. The comparison hit him like a physical blow, and he gripped the porch railing until his knuckles went white. She must have sensed his gaze because she lifted her head then, and Cole saw eyes the color of storm clouds, wide with fear and something that might have been hope. They stared at each other across the 20 yards of prairie grass, 2 souls suspended in a moment that felt both eternal and fragile. Her lips moved, forming words he couldn't hear, and she took a half-step backward as if preparing to flee. The movement sent a jolt of panic through him, not because he feared her, but because he feared losing her to the vast emptiness that had already swallowed too much of his life. Without conscious thought, Cole stepped down from the porch, his boots hitting the hard-packed earth with soft thuds that seemed to echo in the stillness. He moved slowly, the way he approached injured horses, his hands visible and empty, his posture non-threatening. The woman watched him with the intensity of a cornered animal, her breathing quick and shallow, and he could see the pulse fluttering in her throat like a trapped bird. When he was still 10 feet away, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the thin air. "Please don't look," she murmured, and the words hit Cole like a physical blow, carrying such raw shame and vulnerability that he felt his own throat tighten in response. But he was already looking, had been looking since she appeared on his horizon, and what he saw wasn't the broken thing she believed herself to be. He saw courage walking on bleeding feet, dignity wrapped in rags, and a strength that had carried her across miles of unforgiving prairie to collapse at his doorstep, like an answered prayer he'd been too afraid to voice. Cole Hensley had faced down rustlers, survived blizzards that buried entire homesteads, and held his dying wife's hand as life slipped away like water through his fingers. But nothing had prepared him for the sight of this broken woman asking him not to see her. Her words hung in the air between them, a plea that cut deeper than any blade, and he felt something crack open in his chest, not breaking, but opening like a door that had been locked too long. The late afternoon light caught the tears on her cheeks, turning them to gold, and Cole realized that in all his 41 years he had never witnessed anything more beautiful or more heartbreaking than this moment of raw human vulnerability. Instead of turning away as she'd asked, Cole did something that surprised them both. He dropped to one knee in the dust, bringing himself to her eye level, his weathered hands resting on his thigh in a gesture of complete surrender. The movement was instinctive, born from some deep well of understanding that had nothing to do with thought and everything to do with the recognition of one wounded soul by another. From this position, he could see the full extent of her injuries, the bruises that painted her arms in shades of purple and yellow, the cuts on her feet that had left a faint trail of blood in the dust, the way she held her left side as if something there pained her. "I'm looking," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 3 long years. "And what I see is the bravest woman who ever walked onto my land." The words seemed to hit her like a physical force, and she swayed on her feet, her storm-grey eyes widening with something that might have been disbelief. Cole continued, his gaze never leaving her face. "I see someone who's been hurt, yes, but I also see someone who refused to stay down, who walked through hell to get here, and that tells me everything I need to know about who you are." The woman's breath caught in her throat, a sound somewhere between a sob and a gasp, and Cole watched as something shifted in her expression, the wild, cornered look beginning to give way to something softer, more tentative. She was studying his face with the intensity of someone trying to determine if the ground beneath her feet was solid, or if it would give way like everything else in her life had. Her hands, which had been clutched protectively against her chest, slowly relaxed, and Cole caught a glimpse of rope burns around her wrists that made his jaw clench with barely controlled anger. "My name is Cole Hensley," he said, keeping his voice gentle despite the rage building in his chest at whoever had done this to her. "And this is my ranch. You're safe here. Do you—" The words were a promise, spoken with the weight of a man who had learned that some vows were sacred, that some lines could never be crossed. He watched as she processed his words, saw the moment when the meaning truly sank in, and felt his heart break a little at the wonder that crossed her features, as if safety was a concept she'd forgotten existed. The wind picked up then, sending her torn skirt dancing around her legs and lifting the tangled mass of her hair away from her face, revealing the full extent of the bruising along her jaw and the cut on her lower lip that had only recently stopped bleeding. Cole remained perfectly still, letting her take the measure of him, understanding instinctively that any sudden movement might shatter this fragile moment of trust. When she finally spoke again, her voice was stronger, though it still carried the tremor of someone who had learned to expect the worst from the world. "Eliza May," she whispered, and the name fell between them like a gift, like the first word spoken in a new language of possibility that neither of them had dared to imagine just moments before. The kitchen held the golden light of late afternoon like a cupped palm holds water, precious and fleeting. Cole moved with the careful deliberation of a man who had learned that sudden movements could shatter more than just silence. He filled a basin with warm water from the stove, each splash echoing in the space between them like a heartbeat finding its rhythm again. Eliza May sat in the wooden chair he had offered, her bare feet barely touching the worn floorboards, her hands folded in her lap like broken birds learning to trust their wings again. The bruises on her ankles told stories he didn't need to hear spoken aloud, purple and yellow testimonies to cruelties that made his jaw clench with a fury he kept buried deep as winter roots. When he knelt before her with the basin and a clean cloth, she flinched as if his kindness were another kind of violence, her body remembering only the language of harm. "I won't hurt you," he said. And the words came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw by his own memories of another woman who had once needed his protection and hadn't received it in time. The cloth touched her foot like a whispered prayer, gentle as morning mist on prairie grass, and he felt her trembling ease by degrees, like ice melting under the first warm sun of spring. Her skin was pale as moonlight, marked by the harsh kiss of stones and thorns, and he cleaned each wound with the reverence of a man tending sacred ground. The silence between them grew thick with unspoken understanding, heavy as storm clouds gathering on the horizon. She watched his hands work with the wonder of someone discovering that touch could heal instead of harm, that strength could be offered instead of imposed. Her breathing slowed, matching the rhythm of his careful ministrations, and for the first time since she had appeared at his gate, her shoulders began to release their burden of constant vigilance. The water in the basin turned pink with her blood, and the dust of her journey, a baptism of sorts, washing away the miles and the fear that had carried her to his door. "Where did you come from?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper, afraid that speaking too loudly might break whatever fragile trust was building between them, like the first green shoots pushing through hard earth. She was quiet for so long, he thought she wouldn't answer, her gaze fixed on his hands as they wrapped her foot in clean white cloth. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of distances measured not in miles but in heartbreak, in the space between what was promised and what was delivered. From a place where promises were lies and love was just another word for ownership, she said, and the bitterness in her voice made him understand that her wounds went deeper than anything visible on her skin. He finished bandaging her feet with the same careful attention he gave to injured horses, knowing that healing required patience and that trust was earned in moments like these, when vulnerability met kindness and found it genuine. When he looked up, he found her watching him with eyes that held the first glimmer of something that might, in time, become hope. The late afternoon light painted her face in shades of gold and amber, and he saw past the bruises to the strength that had carried her across impossible distances to find sanctuary. She was beautiful, in the way that broken things could be beautiful, like weathered wood that showed its grain more clearly for having survived the storm. "You're safe here," he said, rising to his feet and meaning it with every fiber of his being. The words a vow spoken not just to her, but to the memory of every woman who had ever needed protection and found only indifference or worse. The evening settled over the ranch like a familiar blanket, bringing with it the chorus of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle finding their rest. Cole had given Eliza May his late wife's room, the one he had kept closed for 3 years, like a shrine to grief. And now he stood in the doorway watching her examine the simple furnishings with the careful attention of someone who had learned not to take comfort for granted. The bed was narrow but clean, covered with a quilt that Sarah had stitched during the long winter before the fever took her, each square a memory of better times when the future had seemed as certain as sunrise. Eliza May's fingers traced the pattern with something approaching reverence, and Cole felt his chest tighten with the familiar ache of loss mixed now with something else, something that felt dangerously like the possibility of healing. "She made this," he said, stepping into the room for the first time since Sarah's death, the floorboards creaking under his weight like old bones settling into new positions. The words came easier than he expected, as if Eliza May's presence had somehow loosened the grip that silence had held on his tongue for so long. "Spent the whole winter working on it. Said it would keep us warm through whatever storms might come." His voice caught on the memory, on the bitter irony that no amount of quilted love could keep the fever at bay. That death came for the gentle and the good, with the same indifference it showed to the cruel and the wicked. Eliza May turned to face him, and in her eyes he saw the recognition of someone who understood loss in all its terrible forms, who knew that grief was a country with no maps and no clear borders. "What was her name?" she asked, and the question was asked with such gentle curiosity that it felt like an invitation rather than an intrusion. "Sarah," he said, and speaking her name aloud after so long felt like opening a window in a room that had been sealed too tight, letting in air that was both painful and necessary. Sarah Elizabeth Hensley, and she would have liked you, I think. She had a way of seeing the good in people, even when they couldn't see it in themselves. The lamp flame flickered between them, casting dancing shadows on the walls that seemed to hold the ghosts of conversations never finished, of plans that would never come to fruition. Eliza May sat on the edge of the bed, her bandaged feet barely touching the floor, and for a moment she looked so young and lost that Cole felt something protective and fierce rise in his chest like a tide. "I had a name once, too," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of identity stolen and dignity trampled. "Before I became just another piece of property to be traded and used. Eliza May Carter, daughter of a man who sold me to pay his debts and called it love." The anger that rose in Cole at her words was swift and hot, a flash of lightning illuminating the landscape of his own capacity for violence when faced with such casual cruelty. He had seen men treat horses with more respect than some showed their wives, had witnessed the way power could corrupt even the most basic human decency, but hearing it from her lips made it personal in a way that surprised him with its intensity. "You're not property," he said, the words coming out harder than he intended, edged with a fury that had nowhere to go but inward. "You're not something to be owned or traded or used. You're a person, with your own mind and your own heart, and anyone who can't see that is blind to everything that matters." She looked at him with surprise, as if kindness were a language she was still learning to understand, and he realized that his anger, however righteous, might frighten her after what she had endured. He forced his voice to soften, his hands to unclench, remembering that she needed gentleness now more than she needed his rage on her behalf. "I'm sorry," he said. I can't stand the thought of anyone treating you that way. You deserve better. You deserve everything good this world has to offer." The words hung between them like a promise, like the first line of a story that neither of them knew how to finish, but both were willing to begin. Dawn came slowly to the Dakota plains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed to promise redemption for all the world's broken things. Cole had spent the night in the barn, giving Eliza May the privacy and space she needed to begin the long process of feeling safe again, but sleep had eluded him like water through cupped hands. Instead, he had lain awake, listening to the familiar sounds of his animals settling into rest, thinking about the woman sleeping in his house, and the way her presence had already begun to change the very air he breathed. When the first light crept through the barn doors, he rose and went about his morning chores with the mechanical precision of long habit. But his mind was elsewhere, circling around the question of what came next like a hawk riding thermals above uncertain ground. The smell of coffee and bacon drew him back to the house, and he found Eliza May standing at his stove, moving with the careful grace of someone testing the boundaries of her new reality. She had found one of Sarah's dresses in the wardrobe, a simple blue cotton that fit her slight frame like it had been made for her. And seeing her there in his kitchen, wearing his dead wife's clothes, should have felt like sacrilege, but instead felt like a kind of benediction. Her hair was braided back from her face, revealing the delicate architecture of her features, the high cheekbones and determined chin that spoke of strength beneath the fragility. When she turned to greet him, her smile was tentative but real, the first genuine expression of happiness he had seen cross her face since she arrived. "I hope you don't mind," she said, gesturing toward the breakfast she was preparing with hands that shook only slightly now, the tremor of fear giving way to the simple nervousness of wanting to please. "I wanted to do something to thank you, and cooking is one of the few useful things I know how to do." The bacon sizzled in the pan like applause, and the coffee smelled rich and dark, better than anything he had managed to produce for himself in the 3 years since Sarah's death. He realized that he had forgotten what it felt like to have someone care for him, to come home to warmth and the promise of a shared meal, and the recognition hit him like a physical blow to the chest. "You don't owe me anything," he said, but he accepted the plate she offered with hands that weren't quite steady, touched by the simple generosity of the gesture. They ate in comfortable silence, the morning light streaming through the windows and painting everything in shades of possibility. He watched her eat with the careful attention of someone who had learned not to take food for granted, savoring each bite as if it might be her last. And he found himself making mental notes about her preferences, the way she took her coffee black and strong, the way she cut her bacon into precise, small pieces before eating it. When the meal was finished, she helped him clear the dishes with the easy efficiency of someone accustomed to domestic work, and he found himself wondering about the life she had left behind, about the woman she had been before fear and cruelty had taught her to make herself small. "What will you do now?" he asked, the question hanging between them like a bridge they both had to decide whether to cross. She was quiet for a long moment, her hands stilled in the soapy water, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone standing at the edge of an unknown country. "I don't know," she admitted, and the honesty in her voice was like a gift, like the first flower pushing through snow to announce that spring was possible even after the longest winter. "I've never had the luxury of choosing my own path before. I'm not even sure I know how." She turned to face him then, her eyes bright with unshed tears that might have been grief or hope or some complicated mixture of both. "But I know I can't go back. Whatever happens next, whatever I become, it has to be something I choose for myself." The determination in her voice was like steel wrapped in silk, and Cole felt something shift in his chest, a door opening that he had thought was sealed forever. "Then stay," he said, the words coming out before he could stop them, before he could think about all the reasons why it was impossible, why a man like him had nothing to offer a woman like her. "Stay here, for as long as you need, for as long as you want. Help me run this place, make it something more than just a monument to what I've lost." "Wudai!" The offer hung between them like a prayer, like the first words of a new story that neither of them had dared to imagine but both were suddenly desperate to write.